Chapter 11, personality. That's what we're talking about today. Kind of interesting. As I was going through this chapter, I realized I was seeing things that they were hitting really hard and things that they were kind of just bouncing over. And I realized that the people writing this textbook are probably cognitive psychologists. So they have that mindset, that desire to support all the cognitive psychology precepts, and one of them isn't humanism. But we'll get into that in just a second. They do a good job with Freud. So let's go ahead and get started. Personality refers to the long-standing traits and patterns that propel individuals to consistently think, feel, and behave in specific ways. Our personality is what makes us unique individuals. Each person has an idiosyncratic pattern of enduring long-term characteristics and a manner in which he or she interacts with other individuals and the world around them. Our personalities are thought to be long-term, stable, and not easily changed. The word personality comes from the Latin word persona. In the ancient world, a persona was a mask worn by an actor, and these are the masks we're talking about. Since they had these masks, they didn't have to make faces so that people knew what they were dealing with. So if they wore, this mask or that mask, surprise, they didn't have to show surprise. They could just put on the mask and people knew that they were surprised. While we tend to think of a mask as being worn to conceal one's identity, the theatrical mask was originally used to either represent or project a specific personality trait of the character, and that's what I was just talking about. So there you go. The concept of personality has been studied for at least 2,000 years, beginning with Hippocrates in 370 BCE. Hippocrates theorized that personality traits in human behaviors are based on four separate temperaments associated with four fluids or humors of the body. The choleric temperament was yellow bile from the liver, melancholic temperament, black bile from the kidneys, sanguine temperament, red blood from the heart, and phlegmatic temperament, white phlegm from the lungs. Sanguine blood, choleric, yellow, melancholic, black bile, and phlegmatic phlegm, green phlegm that you cough up from your lungs. Galen, centuries later, the influential Greek physician and philosopher Galen built on Hippocrates' theory, suggesting that both diseases and personality differences could be explained by imbalances in the humors, and that each person exhibits one of the four temperaments. The choleric person is passionate, ambitious, and bold. The melancholic person is reserved, anxious, and unhappy. The sanguine person is joyful, eager, and optimistic, and the phlegmatic person is calm, reliable, and thoughtful. Galen's theory was prevalent for over 1,000 years and continued to be popular through the Middle Ages. In 1780, Franz Gall, a German physician, proposed that the distances between bumps on the skull reveal a person's personality traits, character, and mental mental abilities. This was called phrenology. Oh, there it is. It's phrenology. According to Gall, measuring these distances revealed the sizes of the brain areas underneath, providing information that could be used to determine whether a person was friendly, prideful, murderous, kind, good with languages, and so on. In other words, you could rub somebody's skull and find out what they were like. You could find out what personality they had. Initially, phrenology was very popular. However, it was soon discredited for lack of empirical support and has long been relegated to the status of pseudoscience. Sigmund Freud's psychodynamic perspective of personality was the first comprehensive theory of personality explaining a wide variety of both normal and abnormal behaviors. According to Freud, unconscious drives influenced by sex and aggression along with childhood sexuality, are the forces that influence our personality. Freud attracted many followers who modified his ideas to create new theories about personality. These theorists, referred to as the Neo-Freudians, generally agreed with Freud that childhood experiences matter, but they reduced the emphasis on sex and focused more on the social environment and effects of culture on personality. The perspective of personality proposed by Freud and his followers was the dominant theory of personality for the first half of the 20th century. Freud was the first to systematically study and theorize the workings of the unconscious mind in the manner that we associate with modern psychology. Freud observed individuals, most often women, who reported psychosomatic problems that had no physical basis. These problems were termed hysteria. Now, one of the things about Freud that you need to remember, and that you can scream at Freud all you want, but Freud put together his theory in the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. So what he was dealing with society at that time. He was also dealing with the culture in Vienna, in Austria, which is completely different from anything that you know today. Women covered themselves. They wore lots and lots of clothes, even in the summertime. They didn't ever show any skin. Even their wrists were covered. They wore gloves. They wore high collars on their neck. They wore veils on their hats, so you couldn't see their faces. It was a different time. They never showed. They didn't show their feet. They didn't show their ankles, and that was the aspect that these women were dealing with. So it was a very sexually repressed time. And because of that, yes, of course, sex became extremely important as far as he was concerned, because he was dealing with women that had problems dealing with their repressed sexuality, because that was the culture at the time, not only in Austria but also around the world. In the United States, we saw exactly the same thing. Women wore lots of clothes. Men wore lots of clothes. I mean, it was ridiculous. My goodness, I'm sitting here in shorts and a shirt with cut off sleeves. That would never happen 150 years ago in the 19th century. That would never happen. I mean, if I showed my arms like I'm doing today, or even my legs, people would just be appalled. So Freud concluded that hysteria was a result of sexual abuse in childhood, and that these traumatic experiences had been hidden from consciousness. Now, the reality was that there was no child abuse in the 19th century. Well, there was child abuse, of course, but they didn't call it child abuse because you could do anything to your child short of killing them, punish them in any way that you liked, and it was acceptable behavior. There was no control over what people did to control their children. To explain the concept of conscious versus unconscious experience, Freud compared the mind to an iceberg. He said that only about 1/10 of the mind is conscious and the rest of our mind is unconscious. Our unconscious refers to the mental activity of which we are unaware and are unable to access. According to Freud, unacceptable urges and desires are kept in our unconscious through a process called repression. So we need to repress these ideas that we can't express. We sometimes say things that we don't intend to say by unintentionally substituting another word for that one that we meant. This is known as a Freudian slip. Freudian snip. Freud suggested that slips of the tongue are actually sexual or aggressive urges accidentally slipping out of our unconscious. Speech errors such as this are quite common. Seeing them as a reflection of unconscious desires, linguists today have found that slips of the tongue tend to occur when we are tired, nervous, or not at all optimal. Our optimal level of cognitive functioning isn't actually happening. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I meant bird flu strategy, not bird brain strategy. According to Freud, our personality develops from a conflict between two forces. our biological aggressive and pleasure-seeking drives versus our internal socialized, controlled over these drives. Our personality is a result of our efforts to balance these two competing forces, our id and our ego. Freud suggested, actually, it's our id and our superego. Freud suggested that we can understand this by imagining three interacting systems within our minds. We call them the id, the ego, and the superego. And of course, the id is the pleasure-seeking portion. It seeks immediate gratification. And the superego has to do with what is right or what is considered right, and that would be our morality. And our morality is always trying to control our instincts. And of course, negotiating in between is the ego, or what is actually there, the reality of things. The unconscious id contains our most primitive urges or drives or urges and is present from birth. It directs impulses for hunger, thirst, and sex. Freud believed that the id operates on what we call the pleasure principle, in which the id seeks immediate gratification. Through social interactions with parents and others in a child's environment, the ego and the superego develop to help control the id. And now you've got to remember, one of the things you need to remember about Freud is that he never worked with children. He only worked with adults. So talking about sex meant nothing to him because he wasn't really dealing with underage people. He assumed that this is where it came from. It came from youth, but he actually never dealt with adolescents or children. The ego develops as a child interacts with others, learning the social rules for right and wrong. The superego acts as our conscience. It is our moral compass that tells us how we should behave. It strives for perfection and judges our behavior, leading to feelings of pride or, when we fall short of the ideal, feelings of guilt. In contrast to the instinctual id and the rule-based superego, the ego is the rational part of our personality. It's what Freud considered to be the self, and it is the part of our personality that is seen by others. The job is to balance the demands of the id and the superego in the context of reality. Thus, it operates on what Freud called the reality principle. So we have the pleasure principle, we have the moral principle, and we have the reality principle. The ego helps the id satisfy its desires in a realistic way. And this is kind of interesting. He's driving down the freeway, and of course, the id wants to go 95 miles per hour, and the superego wants to go 15 miles per hour. So the ego goes 15 miles per hour, making everybody happy. The id and the superego are in constant conflict because the id wants instant gratification regardless of the consequences, but the superego tells us that we must behave in socially acceptable ways. Thus, the ego's job is to find the middle ground. It helps satisfy the id's desires in a rational way that will not lead us to feelings of guilt. According to Freud, a person who has a strong ego, which can balance the demands of the id and the superego, has a healthy personality. And that's kind of an interesting cartoon. Freud maintained that imbalances in the system can lead to neurosis, a tendency to experience negative emotions, anxiety disorders, or unhealthy behaviors. A person who is dominated by their id might be narcissistic and impulsive. A person with a dominant superego might be controlled by feelings of guilt and deny themselves even socially acceptable pleasures. Conversely, if the superego is weak or absent, a person might become a psychopath. An overly dominant superego might be seen in an overly controlled individual whose rational grasp on reality is so strong that they are unaware of their emotional needs, or in a neurotic who is overly defensive, overusing ego defense mechanisms. Now, this is really kind of interesting. So superego, just because your superego is strong doesn't mean that you're going to turn out okay. These people can become psychopaths, trying to force their will on other individuals. And of course, We see this with serial killers. They are psychopaths. They're killing people. Why are they killing people? Well, sometimes they're killing people that are immoral or that they see as immoral. We have seen a lot of psychopaths who kill prostitutes. The Green River serial killer was he killed prostitutes. And, anyway, so just because you've got the super morality doesn't mean that your psyche is okay. It can turn into something psychopathic. Now the problem is, of course, that if you're a policeman and you're trying to find this serial killer, the biggest problem is that this person looks normal, that you see them as moral. What you want is the bad guy to look like a bad guy, and that doesn't always happen, especially with serial killers. They're hiding in plain sight. Um, they're always in the area, but you look past them because you're looking for a crazed lunatic, and this person is a crazed lunatic, but it's a controlled. He is so controlled that he's very difficult to catch. And of course, we've had serial killers that have been able to stay away from being arrested for decades. Freud believed that feelings of anxiety result from the ego's inability to mediate the conflict between the id and the superego. When this happens, Freud believed that the ego seeks to restore balance through various protective measures known as defense mechanisms. When certain events, feelings, or yearnings cause an individual anxiety, the individual wishes to reduce that anxiety. To do that, the individual's unconscious mind uses ego defense mechanisms, unconscious protective behaviors that aim to reduce anxiety. The ego, usually conscious, resorts to unconscious strivings to protect the ego from being overwhelmed by anxiety. When we use defense mechanisms, we are unaware that we are using them. Further, they operate in various ways that distort reality. According to Freud, we all use ego defense mechanisms. We all use them. While everyone uses defense mechanisms, Freud believed that overuse of them may be problematic. Let's say Joe is a high school football player. Deep down, Joe feels sexually attracted to males. His conscious belief is that being gay is immoral, and that if he were gay, his family would disown him and he would be ostracized by his peers. Therefore, there is a conflict between his conscious beliefs, being gay is wrong and will result in being ostracized, and his unconscious urges, attraction to males. The idea that he might be gay causes Joe to have feelings of anxiety. How can he decrease his anxiety? Joe may find himself acting very macho, making gay jokes, and picking on a school peer who is gay. This way, Joe's unconscious impulses are further submerged. This is known as latent homosexuality. In other words, it's hidden homosexuality. That latent means it's hidden. It's hidden homosexuality, and this is actually relatively common. It was a lot more common in the past, before people were able to come out of the closet. Back when I first started studying psychology, this was a very common term, and this was very commonly seen. Being in the military at the time, it was interesting to me that the idea, because being gay in the military used to be against the rules, against the law. So we would see a lot of this. We'd see a lot of latent homosexuality. And unfortunately, finding out all this information while I was in the service opened my eyes, and all of a sudden I'm seeing people who fit in this category, and it was a little bit eye-opening, of course. Latent homosexuality. So the more macho you act, potentially the more gay you are, or that didn't sound right. The more macho you act, there is a possibility that you're actually a gay. There are several different types of defense mechanisms. In repression, anxiety causing memories from consciousness are blocked. This is known as repression. As an analogy, let's say your car is making a strange noise, but because you do not have the money to get it fixed, you just turn on the radio so that you no longer hear the strange noise. Eventually, you forget about it. Similarly, in the human psyche, if a memory is too overwhelming to deal with, it might be repressed and thus removed from conscious awareness. This repressed memory might cause symptoms in other areas. The check engine light, of course, is one of those things we try to deny that our car is going. I just destroyed my engine and I'm going to break down. Your check engine light. Denial is where the individual refuses to accept real events because they are too unpleasant to acknowledge. Paul refuses to acknowledge that he has an alcohol problem despite the fact that he gets drunk every single day. And of course, denial is the first, is very common, especially in alcoholics or other drug addicts, but alcoholics especially. You see it. They're never, they don't really have a problem. They can stop anytime they want. That's what they tell themselves. Displacement is where an individual transfers inappropriate urges or behavior onto a more acceptable or less threatening target. Susan is mad at her husband, but instead of yelling at him at the restaurant, she verbally abuses the server instead. Projection is when an individual attributes unacceptable desires in them to others. When my first wife started having an affair, she also started accusing me of having an affair. Very confusing for me, as you can imagine. I didn't know what the hell was going on. I was I was going to an all-male college. It was a little the females in the area were few and far between, but it didn't make much difference to her. She was sure I was finding somebody else because she had found somebody else. So obviously, she didn't want to blame herself, so she blamed me. As not funny as that was. Rationalization is when an individual justifies behaviors by substituting an acceptable reason for less acceptable real reasons. Carla didn't pass her class because she kept skipping and mistaking all of her tests. But she told all of her friends that she didn't pass because the professor didn't like her, which may have been true because she wouldn't come to class. Reaction formation is when an individual adopts beliefs contrary to their own beliefs in order to reduce anxiety. My mother-in-law told my wife after she met me that I was a gold digger and would leave her at the drop of a hat. But to my face, she was as sweet as sugar. And this is a true story. My mother-in-law hated me to the day she died. She thought I was just messing over her daughter. Of course, we've been married for 42 years, as of June 12th, I think. Yeah, June 12th. Anyway, um, not much of a gold digger, am I? Right now, I'm making more money than she is, so maybe she's the gold digger. Regression is when an individual uses a coping strategy from a less mature stage of development to cope with a stressor. When Sylvie was attracted to the men in the bar when her husband was deployed, she began acting and talking like she did when she was a junior high cheerleader before she became sexually active. And actually, this is a true story. My wife was she was deployed. My wife was deployed in Korea, and the head nurse had just gotten married. She was in her late 30s, early 30s, well, middle 30s. She'd just gotten married to a pilot, and she was stationed in Korea, and he was stationed at Colorado Springs in Colorado, of course. And she would, pilots wear really tight clothes. They call them pickle suits um, because they're green. Anyway, she would go to the officers' club. And of course, she's a very attractive lady, and the officers would all hit on her. And she had, before she married her husband, she would flirt with all the pilots. Well, she continued to flirt with him, and my wife said it was really funny because as soon as she would open the door, all of a sudden her voice would get a lot higher. She would start acting like a coquette. She would start flirting with him, but she was acting like she did when she was a cheerleader. And then if something serious happened, she was called back to the hospital. She would run out the door, and as soon as she got through the door, her voice would get deeper, and she'd get really serious. So it was almost like, as soon as she went into the officers' club, all of a sudden she turned into this little girl. She'd sit on people's laps and try to get them to put a certain song on the jukebox, that kind of stuff. Sublimation is when an individual redirects their unacceptable desires through socially acceptable channels. Middle-aged Merle finds teenage girls in his neighborhood attractive, but instead of flirting with them, he has become more religious and only preaches at them when he is around them. Psychosexual development, Freud believed that personality develops during early childhood. Childhood experiences shape our personalities as well as our behavior as adults. He asserted that we develop via a series of stages during childhood. Each of us must pass through these childhood stages, and if we do not have the proper nurturing and parenting during the stage, we will be stuck or fixated in that stage even as adults. In each psychosexual stage of development, the child's pleasure-seeking urges coming from the id are focused on a different area of the body called an erogenous zone. The stages are oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Two of these have to do with your genitals, of course. One has to do with your anus, and the other has to do with your mouth. During the time when Freud was developing his theories, a climate of sexual repression, combined with limited understanding and education surrounding human sexuality, heavily influenced Freud's perspective. Given the sex was a taboo topic, Freud assumed that negative emotional states, neuroses, stem from suppression of unconscious sexual and aggressive urges. For Freud, his own recollection and interpretations of patients' experiences and dreams were sufficient proof that psychosexual stages were universal events in early childhood. And this is the way women dressed. As you can see, they have lots of clothes on. Sometimes they had veils over their faces. You can see they have gloves on. This is a wintertime. This is summertime. You can see their toes, but you can't see their ankles. No skin except for their faces. In the oral stage, birth to 1 year, pleasure is focused on the mouth. Eating and the pleasure derived from sucking, nipples, pacifiers, and thumbs play a large part in the baby's first year of life. At around 1 year of age, babies are weaned from the bottle or breast, and this process can create conflict if not handled properly by caregivers. According to Freud, an adult who smokes, drinks, overeats, or bites her nails is fixated in the oral stage of her psychosexual development. She may have been weaned too early or too late, resulting in these fixation tendencies, all of which seek to ease anxiety. After passing through the oral stage, children enter what Freud termed the anal stage, 1 to 3 years of age. In this stage, children experience pleasure in their bowel and bladder movements, so it makes sense that the conflict in this stage is over toilet training. During this stage of development, children work to master control of themselves. Freud suggested that success at the anal stage depended on how parents handled toilet training. Parents who offer praise and rewards encourage positive results and can help children feel competent. Parents who are harsh in toilet training can cause a child to become so fearful of soiling that they over control and become fixated at the anal stage, leading to the development of an anal retentive personality. The anal retentive personality is stingy and stubborn, has a compulsive need for order and neatness, and might be considered a perfectionist. If parents are too lenient in toilet training, the child may fail to develop sufficient self-control, become fixated at this stage, and develop an anal expulsive personality. The anal expulsive personality is messy, careless, disorganized, and prone to emotional outbursts. Freud's third stage of psychosexual development is the phallic stage, 3 to 6 years, corresponding to the age when children become aware of their bodies and recognize the differences between boys and girls. The erogenous zone in this stage is the genitals. Conflict arises when the child feels a desire for the opposite sex parent and jealousy and hatred toward the same sex parent. For boys, this is called the Oedipus complex, involving a boy's desire for his mother and his urge to replace his father, who is seen as a rival for the mother's attention. At the same time, the boy is afraid his father will punish him for his feelings, so he experiences castration anxiety. The Oedipus complex is successfully resolved when the boy begins to identify with his father as an indirect way to have the mother. Failure to resolve the Oedipus complex may result in fixation and development of a personality that might be described as vain and overly ambitious. Girls experience a comparable conflict in the phallic stage, the Electra complex. The Electra complex, while often attributed to Freud, was actually proposed by Freud's protege, Carl Jung. A girl desires the attention of her father and wishes to take her mother's place. Jung also said that girls are angry with the mother for not providing them with a penis, hence the term penis envy. While Freud initially embraced the Electra complex as a parallel to the Oedipus complex, he later rejected it, yet it remains as a cornerstone of Freudian therapy, thanks in part to academics in the field. And of course, later on, Karen Horney argued that the penis envy doesn't exist. She argued that men have womb envy. They are jealous because they can't have babies. Following the phallic stage of psychosexual development is a period known as the latency period, 6 years to puberty. This period is not considered a stage because sexual feelings are dormant as children focus on their pursuits, such as school, friendships, hobbies, and sports. Children generally engage in activities with peers of the same sex, which serves to consolidate a child's gender role identity. The final stage is the genital stage, from puberty on. In this stage, there is a sexual reawakening as the incestuous urges resurface. The young person redirects these urges to other, more socially acceptable partners who often resemble the other sex parent. People in this stage have mature sexual interests, which for Freud meant a strong desire for the opposite sex. Individuals who successfully completed the previous stages, reaching the genital stage with no fixations, are said to be well-balanced, healthy adults. Criticisms of Freud. While most of Freud's ideas have not found support in modern research, we cannot discount the contributions that Freud has made to the field of psychology. It was Freud who pointed out that a large part of our mental life is influenced by the experiences of early childhood and takes place outside of our conscious awareness. His theories paved the way for others, while Freud's focus on biological drives led him to emphasize the impact of sociocultural factors on personality development. His followers quickly realized that biology alone could not account for the diversity they encountered as the practice of psychoanalysis spread during the time of the Nazi Holocaust. The anti-Semitism which was prevalent during this period of time may have led mainstream psychoanalysts to focus primarily on the universality of the psychological structures of the mind. And one of the things that you need to remember is that most of the psychologists that we talk about were actually Jewish. And most of them had to leave not only Germany, but also Austria. They had to leave Europe, and many of them came to the United States. Some went to England. Eysenck, for example, went to England. So did Freud. Freud fled to England. Erikson came to the United States. Horney came to the United States. Jung stayed in Germany. Jung wasn't Jewish. He was, well, we'll talk about Jung in just a second. Freud attracted many followers who modified his ideas to create new theories about personality. These theorists, referred to as Neo-Freudians, generally agreed with Freud that childhood experiences matter, but de-emphasized sex, focusing more on the social environment and effects of culture on personality. Four notable Neo-Freudians include Alfred Adler, this is Adler right here, Erikson, Carl Jung, and Karen Horney. Yeah, I know it looks like Horney, but it's not. It looks like Jung, but it's Jung. It's pronounced Jung. It's a German pronunciation. And Erikson. Interesting fella, Erikson. Alfred Adler was a colleague of Freud's was the first major theorist to break away from Freud, actually. He used to go to his Wednesday night groups and argue constantly with Freud about all kinds of things. He subsequently founded a school of psychology called individual psychology, which focuses on our drive to compensate for feelings of inferiority. Now, when we talk about Jung, you can see the man wasn't a very attractive person. His other problem was that he had one leg that was shorter than the other. He was not a very large man. Freud was like close to 6 feet tall. Adler was much shorter than that. Um, he had he didn't walk until he was 4 years old. If anybody would have an inferiority complex, it would be Alfred Adler. Especially Freud was a very attractive man, especially when he was younger. So you put the two of them together, and nobody's looking at Adler, everybody's looking at Freud. So Adler did have an inferiority complex. It fit everything about his life. Um, he, that's not funny. When he was 5 years old, his younger brother died in bed right next to him. He died in the early evening, and of course they were in bed, and they didn't. Nobody discovered it until the next day. And of course, by that time, he was cold and stiff. The dead brother, I mean. He also had an older brother, and his older brother was much taller, was much heavier, didn't have one leg shorter than the other, started walking when he was supposed to. So you can imagine that Adler was was second banana for most of his life. And Adler proposed the concept of the inferiority complex. What a shock! An inferiority complex refers to a person's feelings that they lack worth and don't measure up to the standards of others or of society. Adler's ideas about inferiority represent a major difference between his thinking and Freud's. Freud believed that we are motivated by sexual and aggressive urges, but Adler believed that feelings of inferiority in childhood are what drive people to attempt to gain superiority, and that this striving is the force behind all of our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Adler was also a doctor. He was also a brain surgeon, just like Freud was. The difference between Freud and Adler was that Adler went to war. Adler was a doctor during the First World War, while Freud stayed in Vienna. He never left. So Adler, that was an experience where he was actually superior to Freud. Adler believed in the importance of social connections, seeing childhood development emerging through social development rather than the sexual stages Freud outlined. Adler noted the interrelatedness of humanity and the need to work together for the betterment of all, and this may have come out of World War I. He said the happiness of mankind lies in working together and living as if each individual had set himself the task of contributing to the common welfare, with the main goal of psychology being to recognize the equal rights and equality of others. Now, the other interesting thing about Adler was that he was married to a very active woman. Now, Freud's wife was very passive. As a matter of fact, he had an affair with his sister-in-law, his wife's sister, and she didn't do anything about it. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't do anything about it. Adler's wife was a very strong woman, and she was a socialist, and because of that, Freud didn't agree with socialism. So the two of them, they were constantly at loggerheads. So eventually, of course, Adler left the group. Rather than focus on sexual or aggressive motives for behavior as Freud did, Adler focused on social motives. Adler identified three fundamental social tasks that all of us must experience: occupational tasks, societal tasks, and love tasks. Careers, we need to find a career, we need to find friendship, and we also need to find an intimate partner. He also emphasized conscious rather than unconscious motivation, since he believed that the three fundamental social tasks are explicitly known and pursued. That is not to say that Adler did not also believe in unconscious processes. He did, but he felt that conscious processes were more important. One of Adler's major contributions to personality psychology was the idea that our birth order shapes our personality. He proposed that older siblings who start out as the focus of their parents' attention, but must share that attention once a new child joins the family, compensate by becoming overachievers. The youngest children, according to Adler, may be spoiled, leaving the middle child with the opportunity to minimize the negative dynamics of the youngest and oldest children. In other words, the middle child is the one that's going to turn out the best, according to Adler. And guess what? Adler was a middle brother. He was certainly a middle brother, and he was constantly competing with his older brother. Wow. Now that we don't have, people don't have as large a families as we used to, his birth order isn't nearly as interesting as it was back in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Anyway, when there were larger families. Erikson met Freud's daughter, Anna Freud, while he was tutoring in Vienna. It was Anna Freud who encouraged Erikson to study psychoanalysis. In 1933, as Nazism spread across Europe, Erikson fled the country and immigrated to the United States. Erikson later proposed a psychosocial theory of development, suggesting that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan, a departure from Freud's view that personality is fixed in early life. In his theory, Erikson emphasized the social relationships that are important at each stage of personality development, in contrast to Freud's emphasis on sex. Erikson identified 8 stages, each of which represents a conflict or developmental task. The development of a healthy personality and a sense of competence depends on the successful completion of each task. Okay, interesting. Okay, you need to understand who Freud or who Erikson was. Erikson was not Erik Erikson. That was not his name. His birth name was Solmundson. His mother was a Danish Jew, and she was married to a Jewish fellow in Germany, in Frankfurt, and she had an affair with a Danish sea captain. So here she is. She's a Danish Jew. She has she gets impregnated by a Danish sea captain, and she gives birth to a blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby who looks like an Aryan. But of course he's not, because his mother is Jewish. He's raised as Jewish. As soon as his father saw him, his father knew that that she'd been having an affair with somebody, and he left. So here she is. She's a single parent. She's got a baby. He's got no name. So she's he does have a name, because the father's name is Solmundson. So Erik's first name was, his first name was Erik Solmundson, and then she takes him to a pediatrician. She moves out of Frankfurt. She moves to Karlsruhe, and so she meets this pediatrician who falls in love with her and her baby, evidently, and he marries her, and his name is Homburger. So now, and he adopts Erik. So now we've got Erik Homburger, and Erik Homburger thinks that his father is the man that she was married to when she gave birth, because his first name is Solmundson. Then when he's 16 or 17 years old, he finds out that his mother's been lying to him. It really upset him. Upset him so much that he dropped out of high school. And he started traveling around Europe, as interesting as all this is. So now his name is Erik Homburger. It started out as Erik Holmundson, and his name's Erik Homburger. And Homburg, Germany is actually right beside Zweibrücken. I used to live in that area, and we used to go through Homburg all the time. Anyway, kind of interesting. just down the road from Karlsruhe. Okay, so he's traveling around to Europe. He meets Anna Freud. Anna Freud convinces him. Actually, he learns the Montessori school system down in Italy, and then when he goes to Vienna, he meets Anna Freud. She convinces him that he needs to become he needs to study psychology with Freud, and he needs to work with children, and that's what she did. Now, I told you before that Freud never actually worked with children. He didn't. Anna Freud did all that work, and she was assisted by Erikson. And then in 1933, actually 32 is when Hitler took over in Germany, and in 1933, the repression of the Jews was so noxious that he left. He came to the United States, and while he was on his trip, it was a 2-week trip from Europe to the United States. He got all these offers. He got one from Stanford, he got one from Yale, he got one from Harvard, because he was a child psychologist. And he decided that he was going to reinvent himself. And so he became Erik, son of himself, or Erik Erikson. And that's how he got the name Erik Erikson. His name didn't start out as Erik Erikson. It started out as Erik Solmonson, and then it changed to Erik Holmberger, and then eventually, he never did find his father, by the way, and he still was pretty upset with his mother, as curious as that is. Okay, Erik later proposed a psychosocial theory of development, suggesting that, and the other thing about Erikson that you need to remember is that he never had any friends, and the reason he didn't have any friends was because he went to school in a Jewish school, and he looked German. He was blonde-haired and blue-eyed, so he looked German. So the Jewish kids didn't like him, but the German kids didn't like him either because he was Jewish. So he didn't have any friends. So he grew up without any friends. So Erikson later proposed a psychosocial theory of development, suggesting that an individual's personality develops throughout the lifespan, a departure from Freud's view that personality is fixed in early life. In his theory, Erikson emphasized the social relationships that are important at each stage of personality development, in contrast to Freud's emphasis on sex. Erikson identified 8 stages, each of which represents a conflict for developmental task. The development of a healthy personality and a sense of competence depends on the successful completion of each task. And there are the 8 stages. We've gone through these before, I believe, in another chapter. This is Carl Jung, and as you can see, he thinks a lot of himself. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and protege of Freud. The interesting thing about Jung, and there's something interesting about all these people, Carl Jung was not Jewish. He was from Switzerland. His father was a minister. His father was a Swiss Reformed Church minister. And if you know anything about Reformed churches are very evangelical. They're about the most fundamentalist Christian churches out there, especially in the early days, of course. Anyway, so his father was a very fundamentalist Christian, which is interesting that he joined a group of Jewish psychologists, but he did, and he was part of the group for an extended length of time. Carl Jung was actually chosen by Freud to be his successor. He thought that Freud was the closest to him. As you can see, he's an attractive man, and he had a big ego. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and protege of Freud, who later split off from him and developed his own theory, which he called the analytical theory. Really kind of interesting. They split over. Oh, wait a minute. They split over her. Whoops. There. They split over her. Karen Horney. Jung had an affair with her, and Freud told everybody to leave her alone. Jung had a thing for Freud. If you read his letters, it looks like there's some homoeroticism in his letters. So he loved Freud, and Freud told everybody to leave Karen Horney alone, and Jung didn't do it. He had an affair with her. Okay, so Jung developed this analytical psychology. The focus of analytical psychology is on working to balance opposing forces of conscious and unconscious thought and experience within one's personality. According to Jung, the work is a continuous learning process, mainly occurring in the second half of life, of becoming aware of unconscious elements and integrating them into consciousness. Jung's split from Freud was based on two major disagreements. First, Jung, like Adler and Erikson, did not accept that sexual drive was a primary motivator in a person's mental life. Second, although Jung agreed with Freud's concept of a personal unconscious, he thought it to be incomplete. In addition, the personal unconscious Jung focused on the collective unconscious. Our genealogical lines are our labyrinth, the dead live within us. And that's the idea of the collective unconscious. You have elements of your genealogy, of your past, of your ancestors, lives within you. The collective unconscious is a universal version of the personal unconscious, holding mental patterns or temporary traces which are common to all of us. These ancestral memories, which Jung called the archetypes, are represented by universal themes in various cultures as expressed through literature, art, and dreams. Jung said that these themes reflect common experiences of people the world over, such as facing death, becoming independent, and striving for mastery. And these are some of 12 of the archetypes: the innocent, the orphan, the hero, the caregiver, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, the ruler, the magician, the sage, and the jester. Those are all the 12 of the those are 12 of the archetypes. Jung believed that through biology, each person is handed down the same themes and that the same types of symbols, such as the hero, the maiden, the sage, and the trickster, are present in the folklore and fairy tales of every culture. In Jung's view, the task of integrating these unconscious archetypes, archetypal aspects of the self is part of the self-realization process in the second half of life. With this orientation toward self-realization, Jung parted ways with Freud's belief that personality is determined solely by past events and anticipated the humanistic movement with his emphasis on self-actualization and orientation toward the future. Jung also proposed two attitudes or approaches toward life: extroversion and introversion. These ideas are considered Jung's most important contributions to the field of personality psychology, as almost all models of personality now include these concepts. If you are an extrovert, then you are a person who is energized by being outgoing and socially oriented. You derive your energy from being around others. If you are an introvert, then you are a person who may be quiet and reserved, or you may be social, but your energy is derived from your inner psychic activity. Jung believed a balance between extroversion and introversion best served the goal of self-realization. There you go. These are the extroverts and introverts, how they handled quarantine time. The introvert was fine, and the extrovert wanted out. Anyway, another concept proposed by Jung was a persona, which he referred to as a mask that we adopt. According to Jung, we consciously create this persona. However, it is derived from both our unconscious or our conscious experiences and our collective unconscious. Jung believed that the persona is a compromise between who we really are, our true self, and what society expects us to be. We hide those parts of ourselves that are not aligned with society's expectations, like homosexuality. That would be one of those things that you hide. Karen Horney was one of the first women trained as Freudian psychoanalysts. During the Great Depression, Horney moved from Germany to the United States and subsequently moved away from Freud's teaching. Like Jung, Horney believed that each individual has a potential for self-realization and that the goal of psychoanalysis should be moving toward a healthy self rather than exploring early childhood patterns of dysfunction. So this is kind of Jung and Horney were looking more at positive psychology and positive things, whereas Freud was trying to figure out why there were so many crazy people in the world. Remember, this is what Freud dealt with. Freud dealt with dysfunction. He dealt with hysteria, and that's where his theory came from. His theory came from dysfunction. But of course, their argument was, well, what about normal people? And of course, Karen Horney, who is much better looking, and this isn't a very good picture. Actually, there aren't very many pictures of her when she was younger, but she was quite attractive. Horney also disagreed with Freudian idea that girls have penis envy and are jealous of male biological features. According to Horney, any jealousy is most likely culturally based due to the greater privileges that males often have, meaning that the differences between men's and women's personalities are culturally based, not biologically based. She further suggested that men have womb envy because they cannot give birth, except for this man, of course. This is a transgender man, and he was able to get pregnant and able to have a baby. Horney's theories focused on the role of unconscious anxiety. She suggested that normal growth can be blocked by basic anxiety stemming from needs not being met, such as childhood experiences of loneliness and or isolation. Horney suggested three styles of coping. The first coping style, moving toward people, relies on affiliation and dependence. These children become dependent on their parents and other caregivers in an effort to receive attention and affection, which provides relief from anxiety. When these children grow up, they tend to use the same coping strategy to deal with relationships, expressing an intense need for love and acceptance. They become codependent. The second coping style, moving against people, relies on aggression and assertiveness. Children with this coping style find that fighting is the best way to deal with an unhappy home situation, and they deal with their feelings of insecurity by bullying other children. As adults, people with this coping style tend to lash out with hurtful comments and exploit others. The third coping style, moving away from people, centers on detachment and isolation. These children handle their anxiety by withdrawing from the world. They need privacy and tend to be self-sufficient. When these children are adults, they continue to avoid such things as love and friendship, and they also tend to gravitate toward careers that require little interaction with others. Behaviorists do not believe in biological determinism. They do not see personality traits as inborn. Instead, they view personality as significantly shaped by the reinforcements and consequences outside of the organism. In other words, people behave in a consistent manner based on prior learning. B.F. Skinner, a strict behaviorist, believed that environment was solely responsible for all behavior, including the enduring, consistent behavior patterns studied by personality theorists. Skinner proposed that we demonstrate consistent behavior patterns because we have developed certain response tendencies. We learn to behave in particular ways. We increase the behaviors that lead to positive consequences, and we decrease the behaviors that lead to negative consequences. Skinner disagreed with Freud's idea that personality is fixed in childhood. He argued that personality develops over our entire life, not only in the first few years. Now, the strange thing is that if you read Freud and then you read all the other personality theorists, you can see that they were all arguing with Freud. They were all saying, this is why Freud's wrong. So it's in order to understand personality theories, you need to understand Freud first. If you understand Freud first, then you understand what they're talking about. Because normally what they're doing is they're arguing with Freud's ideas. Bandura proposed the concept of reciprocal determinism, in which cognitive processes, behavior, and context all interact. each factor influencing and being influenced by the others simultaneously. Cognitive processes refer to all characteristics previously learned, including beliefs, expectations, and personality characteristics. Behavior refers to anything that we do that may be rewarded or punished. Finally, the context in which the behavior occurs refers to the environment or situation, which includes rewarding, punishing stimuli. Bandura's key contribution to learning theory was the idea that much learning is vicarious. We learn by observing someone else's behavior and its consequences, which Bandura called observational learning. He felt that this type of learning also plays a part in the development of our personality. Just as we learn individual behaviors, we learn new behavior patterns when we see them performed by other people or models. Drawing on the behaviorist ideas about reinforcement, Bandura suggested that whether we choose to imitate a model's behavior depends on whether we see the model reinforced or punished. Through observational learning, we come to learn what behaviors are acceptable and rewarded in our culture, and we also learn to inhibit deviant or socially unacceptable behaviors by seeing what behaviors are punished. Bandura has studied a number of cognitive and personal factors that affect learning and personality development, and most recently has focused on the concept of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is our level of confidence in our own abilities developed through our social experiences. Self-efficacy affects how we approach challenges and reach goals. In observational learning, self-efficacy is a cognitive factor that affects which behaviors we choose to imitate, as well as our success in performing those behaviors. Julian Rotter proposed the concept of locus of control, another cognitive factor that affects learning and personality development. Distinct from self-efficacy, which involves our belief in our own abilities, locus of control refers to our beliefs about the power we have over our lives. In Rotter's view, people possess either an internal or an external locus of control. Those with an internal locus of control, internals, tend to believe that most of their outcomes are the direct result of their effort. Those with external locus of control, externals, tend to believe that our outcomes are outside of their control. Externals see their lives as being controlled by other people, luck, or chance. Walter Mischel worked with delayed gratification and personality. Mischel determined that when willingness to delay gratification becomes part of the individual's personality, the individual is able to become a more successful student, had higher SAT scores, had positive peer relationships, were less likely to have substance abuse issues. As adults, they also had more stable marriages. Later researchers determined that delayed gratification was situational and not an absolute personality trait. Let me take a quick break. As the third force in psychology, here we go. We're only going to deal with humanism for a minute. As the third force in psychology, the first two forces are, of course, psychoanalysis, Freud's psychoanalysis, and the second is behaviorism. Humanism is considered the third force. Humanism is touted as a reaction both to the pessimistic determinism of psychoanalysis, with its emphasis on psychological disturbance, and to the behaviorist view of humans passively reacting to the environment, which has been criticized as making people out to be personalityless robots. It does not suggest that psychoanalytic behaviorists and other points of view are incorrect, but argues that these perspectives do not recognize the depth and meaning of human experience and fail to recognize the innate capacity for self-directed change and transforming personal experiences. The humanist perspective focuses on how healthy people develop. One pioneering humanist, Abraham Maslow, studied people who he considered to be healthy, creative, and productive, including Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and others. Maslow found that such people share similar characteristics such as being more open, creative, loving, spontaneous, compassionate, concerning for others, and accepting for themselves. Humanist Carl Rogers' main idea about personality regards self-concept, our thoughts and feelings about ourselves. Rogers further divided the self into two categories, the ideal self and the real self. The ideal self is the person that you would like to be. The real self is the person you actually are. Rogers focused on the idea that we need to achieve consistency between these two selves. We experience congruence when our thoughts about our real self and ideal self are very similar. In other words, when our self-concept is accurate. High congruence leads to a greater sense of self-worth and a healthy, productive life. Parents can help their children achieve this by giving them unconditional positive regard or unconditional love. According to Rogers, as persons are accepted and prized, they tend to develop a more caring attitude towards themselves. Conversely, when there is a great discrepancy between our ideal and actual selves, we experience a state Rogers called incongruence, which can lead to maladjustment. The Minnesota study of twins reared apart conducted research with twins from 1979 to 1999. In the study, 350 pairs of twins, including pairs of identical and fraternal twins, reared together and apart. Researchers found that identical twins, whether raised together or apart, had very similar personalities. These findings suggest that heritability of some personality traits. And of course, these two guys were raised apart, yet they're both firemen. They both wear the same goofy looking mustache. They both wear similar glasses. They both married women with the same name. I think it was Karen, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, my wife's name is Karen as well. As curious as that is. But as you can see, they were both firemen. And they both had 2 kids. Heritability refers to the proportion of difference among people that is attributed to genetics. Some of the traits that the study reported as having more than a 0.50 heritability rate, including leadership, obedience to authority, a sense of well-being, alienation, resistance to stress, and fearfulness. The implication is that some aspects of our personalities are largely controlled by genetics. However, it's important to point out that traits are not determined by a single gene, but by a combination of many genes, as well as by epigenetic factors that control whether the genes are expressed. This was an interesting study. These were identical triplets. Very rare. You don't see identical triplets very often. That means that the ova split in 3 parts instead of 2 parts. Didn't split in half, it split in 3 parts. They had almost identical personalities. It was bizarre. They all smiled the same. They all acted the same. They met in college. As curious as that is, this was a television program on CNN, I think, if I'm not mistaken, but it was a while back. Most contemporary psychologists believe temperament has a biological basis due to its appearance very early in our lives, and this is according to Rothbard in 2011. Thomas and Chess found that babies could be categorized into one of 3 temperaments: easy, difficult, or slow to warm. However, environmental factors, family interactions, for example, and maturation can affect the ways in which children's personalities are expressed. Research suggests that there are 2 dimensions of our temperament that are important parts of our adult personality: reactivity and self-regulation. Reactivity refers to how we respond to new or challenging environmental stimuli. Self-regulation refers to our ability to control that response. Trait theorists believe personality can be understood via the approach that all people have certain traits or characteristic ways of behaving. Trait theorist Gordon Allport found 4,500 words in the English language that could describe people. He organized these personality traits into three categories: cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. A cardinal trait is one that dominates your entire personality and hence your life. Cardinal traits are not very common. Few people have personalities dominated by a single trait. Instead, our personalities typically are composed of multiple traits. Central traits are those that make up our personalities, such as loyal, kind, agreeable, friendly, sneaky, wild, and grouchy. Secondary traits are those that are not quite as obvious or as consistent as central traits. They are present under specific circumstances and include preferences and attitudes. In an effort to make the list of traits more manageable, Raymond Cattell narrowed down to 16 factors or dimensions of personality: warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. He developed a personality assessment based on these 16 factors called the 16PF. Instead of a trait being present or absent, each dimension is scored over a continuum from high to low. And there they are, the 16PF. Psychologists Hans and Sybil Eysenck were personality theorists who focused on temperament, the inborn, genetically based personality. They believe personality is largely governed by biology. The Eysencks viewed people as having two specific personality dimensions: introversion, extroversion, and neuroticism stability. Now, this is really kind of a curious picture because there's Hans and Sybil, their little girl, which nobody's paying any attention to, and the cat, which is everybody's paying attention to the cat. Okay. But they're sitting for a family portrait. And of course, the cat looks about as grouchy as a cat can look, as curious as that is. According to Eysenck's theory, people high on the trait of extroversion are sociable and outgoing and readily connect with others, whereas people high on the trait of introversion have a higher need to be alone, engage in solitary behaviors, and limit their interactions with others. In the neuroticism stability dimension, people high on neuroticism tend to be anxious. They tend to have an overactive sympathetic nervous system, and even with low stress, their bodies and emotional state tend to go into fight or flight reaction. People high on stability tend to need more stimulation to activate their fight or flight reaction and are considered more emotionally stable. Later, the Eysencks added a third dimension, psychoticism, versus superego control. In this dimension, people are high on psychoticism tend to be independent thinkers, cold, nonconformists, impulsive, antisocial, and hostile, whereas people who are high on superego control tend to have high impulse control. They are more altruistic, empathetic, cooperative, and conventional. Another personality theory is the five-factor model, with its 5 factors referred to as the Big Five personality factors. It is the most popular theory in personality psychology today and the most accurate approximation of the basic personality dimensions. The 5 factors are openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. In the 5-factor model, each person has each factor, but they occur along a spectrum. Openness to experience is characterized by imagination, feelings, actions, and the ideas. Now, one of the things that we need to talk about, this is Costa and McCrae were the ones that came up who get credit for the theory, but actually the theory was developed by Tupes and Crystal in the 1950s. And what they were doing, Tupes and Crystal worked for the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation stands for Research and Development. It used to be part of the Air Force. And then it it broke away from the Air Force and became a separate entity. And no military people worked for them. But the RAND Corporation, they worked for the RAND Corporation, and the Air Force tasked them. The Air Force wasn't the Air Force during World War II. They were the Army Air Force is what they were. In the late 1940s, they decided that 1947, they decided that they needed a separate arm for the Air Force because it was becoming too big, and the Army just couldn't handle them anymore. So they developed their own branch of the service called the United States Air Force. Then they realized that, all the stuff that we were doing through the Army, that fits Army people who are on the ground. They become infantry officers, they become artillery officers, or cavalry officers. But we're Air Force, and we have a different mission, and we need different people with different personalities for our mission. So in the late 1940s, early 1950s, Tupes and Crystal were tasked with coming up with a personality test, so that they could give this test to select individuals who wanted to be officers in the Air Force, and they would be able to select the best people for them. Now, when you think of it that way, of course, this big 5-factor model makes a whole lot more sense. What in the world are military? What does the Air Force need? What kind of personalities does an Air Force person need in order to be a good officer? Well, one of them is openness. They need to be open to experience. And as we go through these, I want you to think of a military officer. And there's a difference between Air Force officers and Marine officers and Army officers and naval officers because they have different missions. So they need to have different personalities. And that's one of the things that Tupes and Crystal were trying to do. So they came up with it. They wrote it up. They actually published an article about it, but wasn't picked up by academia because a lot of this stuff was semi-secret. So it wasn't until the 1980s that anybody read Tupes and Crystal, and the people that read it were McCrae and what was the other guy? Costin McCrae were the two guys. And they were at the University of Illinois, and they came up with this big 5-factor model. But it was actually developed by Tupes and Crystal, which kind of upsets me a little bit because here, these guys that took somebody else's idea, they're the ones that get all the credit for it, even though Tupes and Crystal came up with exactly the same idea and published it, but it just was not picked up by academia. Anyway, okay, so as we go through these, I want you to think of what we need as an Air Force officer. Openness to experience is characterized by imagination, feelings, actions, and ideas. People who score high on this factor tend to be curious and have a wide range of interests, and that fits. So the more imagination you have, that makes you a better officer for the Air Force. Conscientiousness is characterized by competence, self-discipline, thoughtfulness, and achievement, striving, goal-directed behavior. People who score high on this factor are hardworking and dependable. Numerous studies have found a positive correlation between conscientiousness and academic success. And of course, we want our Air Force officer to be conscientious as well. We need them to work hard. Extroversion is characterized by sociability, assertiveness, excitement seeking, and emotional expression. People who score high on this factor are usually described as outgoing and warm. Not surprisingly, people who score high on both extroversion and openness are more likely to participate in adventure and risky sports due to their curious and excitement seeking nature. Now, if you want this guy to fly an airplane, you want him to be a fighter pilot. Yeah, you want him to be as extroverted as possible. And you need to have an individual that is open to is open to adventure. The fourth factor is agreeableness, which is the tendency to be pleasant, cooperative, trustworthy, and good-natured. People who score low on agreeableness tend to be described as rude and uncooperative. Yet one recent study reported that men who scored low on this factor actually earned more money than men who were considered more agreeable. Now that's kind of a curiosity. Now, why in the world would somebody who's rude and uncooperative make more money than somebody that is good-natured and cooperative? And the answer is he asks for more money, and that's why he gets more money. And of course, he's needed. So this is really kind of curious. So what do you want your military officers to be? Do you want them to be pleasant, cooperative, trustworthy, and good-natured, or do you want them to be rude and uncooperative? Well, the answer is you want them to be someplace in the middle. You don't want them to be so pleasant and cooperative and good-natured that people walk all over them. You need them to order people around. Therefore, they need some degree of rudeness, but they need to be cooperative. They need to take orders from up above, so they need to be cooperative. So they need it someplace in between. Here we go for the good Air Force officer. Neuroticism is the tendency to experience negative emotions. People high on neuroticism tend to experience emotional instability and are characterized as angry, impulsive, and hostile. Watson and Clark in 1984 found that people reporting high levels of neuroticism also tend to report feelings of anxiousness and unhappiness. People who score low in neuroticism tend to be calm and even-tempered, and that's, of course, what you want your military or your Air Force officer to be. I was really kind of curious because when I first started studying psychology, I was on an Air Force base, and I was enlisted, and all the other people in the class were officers, and some of them were civilians. But most of them were officers, and many of them were pilots. And for that reason, when we went through these, I could look around the room and I could see exactly what was going on here. Now, curiously, when I was in that program, they voted me the most stable person in the class, which was kind of a curiosity. But then again, when you're looking at military officers, they can't, if they're too pleasant, if they're too happy, if they're, all of that happy stuff, if they're too much of that, then they may not be able to get the job done. So there has to be some negativity, not neuroticism. This one, they need to be fairly stable in order to not push the button when somebody tells them to destroy Russia or something. The big five personality factors each represent a range between two extremes. Most of us tend to lie somewhere midway along the continuum of each factor rather than at polar ends. It's important to note that the big five factors are relatively stable over our lifespan, with some tendency for the factors to increase or decrease slightly. And we took all of these personality profile tests. We did a personality profile test based on the five-factor model, and mine came out more stable than anybody's. Researchers have found that conscientiousness increases through young adulthood into middle age as we become better able to manage our personal relationships and careers. Agreeableness also increases with age, peaking between 50 to 70 years. Neuroticism and extroversion tend to decline slightly with age. The big five factors have been shown to exist across ethnicities, cultures, and ages, and may have substantial biological and genetic components. And of course, as we're going to find out, other cultures don't adhere to the big five-factor model. And as you're going to find out in cultural psychology, there are a lot of different cultures that embrace different ideas. So the big five-factor model isn't always accurate, except in the Western world. Personality is shaped by both genetic and environmental factors. The culture in which you live is one of the most important environmental factors that shapes your personality. The term culture refers to all of the beliefs, customs, art, and traditions of a particular society. Culture is transmitted to people through language, as well as through the modeling of culturally acceptable and non acceptable behaviors that are either rewarded or punished. Personality psychologists have become interested in the role of culture in understanding personality. It appears that there are both universal and culture specific aspects that account for variation in people's personalities. Western ideas about personality may not be acceptable to other cultures. The strength of personality traits varies across cultures. Asian cultures are more collectivist, and people in these cultures tend to be less extroverted, skewing the big five. People in Central and South American cultures tend to score higher on the big five in openness to experience, whereas Europeans score higher on neuroticism. There seem to be regional personality differences within the United States. Researchers analyzed responses from over 1.5 million individuals in the United States and found that there are three distinct regional personality clusters. Cluster 1 is in the upper Midwest and deep South and is dominated by people who fall into the friendly and conventional personality. And this is where I live, right here. I've lived here, I've lived here, I've lived here, I've lived there. I've lived out in California, around Los Angeles twice. I've lived in Saley. I've lived in Texas, Lubbock. That's Lubbock right there. And Wichita Falls and San Antonio. I lived in Nebraska. I lived in Montana, up near the border. Where else have I lived? That's about it. That's enough. Cluster 2 includes the West and is dominated by people who are more relaxed, emotionally stable, calm, and creative. That's where you guys are. Cluster 3 in the Northeast has more people who are stressed, irritable, and depressed. People who live in clusters 2 and 3 are also generally more open. That's according to research by Renfro et al. 2013. One explanation for the regional differences is selective migration. Selective migration is a concept that people choose to move to places that are compatible with their personalities and needs. Renfro and colleagues in 2009, that should be there, noted an overlap between geographical regions and personality characteristics that goes beyond the often used explanations of religion, racial diversity, and education. Their research suggests that psychological profile of a region is closely related to that of its residents. They found that levels of openness and conscientiousness in a state may predict voting patterns, indicating that there are correlations between geographic regions and personality differences between liberals and conservatives related to political views, levels of economic vitality, and entrepreneurial rates. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures place emphasis on different basic values. One of the things about this selective migration, California lost people in the last census, and they said, "Where are these people going?" Well, the conservatives that live in California, who have no representation because California is fairly liberal, they're moving to Texas. As weird as that is. Because the people in Texas are conservative like they are. So Texas is getting people from California, but they tend to be more conservative people. Individualist cultures and collectivist cultures place emphasis on different basic values. People who live in individualist cultures tend to believe that independence, competition, and personal achievement are important. Individuals in Western nations, such as the United States, England, and Australia, score high on individualism, as does most of Western Europe. People who live in collectivist cultures value social harmony, respectfulness, and group needs over individual needs. Individuals who live in countries in Asia, Africa, and South America score high on collectivism. These values influence personality. That's the me and the we. Collectivist is we, and the individualist is me. Dana in 1986 suggested that personality assessment services for Native Americans are often provided without a proper recognition of culture-specific responses and tribe-specific frame of reference. Assessors need to have more than a general knowledge of history, tribal differences, and contemporary culture on reservations, and the levels of acculturation in order to interpret psychological test responses with a minimal bias. And the reality is each tribe is different. And you need to recognize that. And it may be that the Navajo Nation is not, everybody's not the same on the Navajo Nation. Despite the fact that everybody's Dene, it may actually be that people that live in Crown Point are different from people that live in Tuba City, are different from people that live in Salie, who are different from people that live in Chinle, Window Rock, and what's the other place? Shiprock, and Aneth. I guess we have a new Anyway, we've got, we're expanding Dene College to Aneth, Utah. So here's the reality. Just because you're an American Indian doesn't mean you understand somebody from Montana or somebody from South Dakota or North Dakota or Washington or Oregon, because they have different cultures. They have a different culture. Really kind of interesting. When I was going to powwows, you could tell what tribe somebody was from by their regalia, by the outfit that they wore. The Crow, for example, you can see these bustles of eagle feathers. The Crow don't have bustles of eagle feathers. They have bustles of crow feathers. And it's just a little bitty, it's not very big. It's just about the size of both your fists put together. But of course, everybody else has, well, other people, other tribes, especially Siouan tribes, and now Algonquian tribes, they have fairly large bustles. So you can look at the regalia, you can tell where somebody's from, which I think is kind of cool. There are three approaches that can be used to study personality in cultural context: the cultural comparative approach, the indigenous approach, the combined approach, which incorporates elements of both views. Since ideas about personality have a Western basis, the cultural comparative approach seeks to test Western ideas about personality in other cultures to determine whether they can be generalized and if they have cultural validity. And this is an individual from the European Union, and this is somebody from China, and neither of them, they don't understand each other. Researchers used the cultural comparative approach to test the universality of the five-factor model. They found applicability in numerous cultures around the world, with the big five factors being stable in many cultures. The indigenous approach came about in reaction to the dominance of Western approaches to the study of personality in non-Western settings. Because Western-based personality assessments cannot fully capture the personality constructs of other cultures, the indigenous model has led to the development of personality assessment instruments that are based on constructs relevant to the culture being studied. The third approach to cross-cultural studies of personality is the combined approach, which serves as the bridge between Western and indigenous psychology as a way of understanding both universal and cultural variations in personality. Self-report inventories. Now we're going to talk about some of the personality inventories that are out there. Self-report inventories are a kind of objective test used to assess personality. They typically use multiple choice items or numbered scales, which represent a range from 1 strongly disagree to 5 strongly agree. Self-report inventories are generally easy to administer and cost-effective. There is an increased likelihood of test takers being inclined to answer in ways that are intentionally or unintentionally more socially desirable, exaggerated, biased, or misleading. Bunch of self-report inventories out there. Beck's Depression Inventory. Anytime somebody gives you a survey, it's a self-report inventory. One of the most widely used personality inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, also known as the MMPI. First published in 1943 with 504 true or false questions and updated to the MMPI-2 in 1989 with 567 questions. The original MMPI was based on a small limited sample composed mostly of Minnesota farmers and psychiatric patients. The revised inventory was based on a more representative national sample to allow for better standardization. The MMPI-2 takes 1 to 2 hours to complete. Responses are scored to produce a clinical profile composed of 10 scales: hypochondriasis, depression, hysteria, psychopathic deviance, social deviance, masculinity versus femininity, paranoia, psychasthenia, that's obsessive compulsive qualities, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. There's also a scale to certain risk factors for alcohol abuse. In 2008, the test was again revised using more advanced methods to the MMPI-2RF revised form. This version takes about 1/2 the time to complete and has only 338 questions. Despite the new test advantages, the MMPI-2 is more established and is still more widely used. Typically, the tests are administered by computer. Now, the reality is that you're going to get a score for everything. So the fact that most of us aren't schizophrenic, we're still going to get a schizophrenia score. We're still going to get a hypochondriasis score. We're still going to get a hysteria score. Although the MMPI was originally developed to assist in clinical diagnosis of psychological disorders, it is now used for occupational screening, such as in law enforcement and in college, career, and marital counseling. In addition to clinical scales, the tests also have validity and reliability scales. One of the validity scales, the lie scale or the L scale, consists of 15 items and is used to ascertain whether the respondent is faking good, underreporting psychological problems to appear healthier. Reliability scales test an instrument's consistency over time, assuring that if you take the MMPI-2RF today and then again 5 years later, your two scores will be similar. Butler and colleagues in 1988 gave the MMPI to newly recruited police officers and then to the same police officers 2 years later. After 2 years on the job, police officers' responses indicated an increased vulnerability to alcoholism, somatic symptoms, vague unexplained physical complaints, and anxiety. When the test was given to an additional 2 years later, 4 years after starting on the job, the results suggested high risk for alcohol-related difficulties. Another method for assessment of personality is projective tests. This kind of test relies on one of the defense mechanisms proposed by Freud, projection, as a way to assess unconscious processes. During this type of testing, a series of ambiguous cards is shown to the person being tested, who then is encouraged to project his feelings, impulses, and desires onto the cards by telling a story, interpreting an image, or completing a sentence. Many projective tests have undergone, this is a Rorschach inkblot sample. This is a thematic apperception test picture. Many projective tests have undergone standardization procedures and can be used to assess whether someone has unusual thoughts or a high level of anxiety or is likely to become volatile. Some examples of projective tests are the Rorschach inkblot tests, the thematic apperception test, the contemporized themes concerning black tests, the TEMIS, tell me a story, and the Rotter incomplete sentence blank, and we're going to go through all of those. This is a picture from the thematic apperception test. Projective tests are less subject to intentional distortion. It is hard to fake good because it is not obvious what good is an answer is, what a good answer is. Projective tests are more time-consuming for the evaluator than self-report inventories. An evaluator scores the Rorschach using the Exner scoring system. The test is considered a valid and reliable measure. However, the validity of other projective tests is questionable, and the results are often not usable for court cases. And this is another thematic apperception test picture. The Rorschach ink blot test was developed in 1921 by a Swiss psychologist named Hermann Rorschach, and this is what he looked like. It is a series of symmetrical ink blot cards that are presented to a client by a psychologist. Upon presentation of each card, the psychologist asks the client, "What might this be?" What the test taker sees reveals unconscious feelings and struggles. The Rorschach has been standardized using the Exner system and is effective in measuring depression, psychosis, and anxiety. And I looked up the Exner system. I had never used it myself. It has to do with putting it in three different mindsets. I would have to. It's difficult to explain. Anyway, you can use that. Now, the strange thing about Hermann Rorschach, he died the year after this picture was taken. He died in 1922. Now, the odd thing about him, I think he looks like Brad Pitt. Maybe his head's shaped the same. He keeps his mouth the same. His bottom lip his upper lip is kind of thin, but his bottom lip is bigger. I don't know. There's something about him that makes him look like Brad Pitt to me. Maybe he doesn't to anybody else, but he looks like Brad Pitt to me. Anyway, not important. The thematic apperception test was created in the 1930s by Henry Murray and Christina Morgan. A person taking the thematic apperception test is shown 8 to 12 ambiguous pictures and is asked to tell a story about each picture. The stories give insight into their social world, revealing hopes, fears, interests, and goals. The storytelling format helps to lower a person's resistance, divulging unconscious personal details. That's according to Kramer in 2004. The TAT has been used in clinical settings to evaluate psychological disorders. More recently, it has been used in counseling settings to help clients gain a better understanding of themselves and achieve personal growth. Standardization of test administration is virtually non-existent among clinicians, and the test tends to be modest to low on validity and reliability. And this is another picture from the TAT. We've seen 3 of them so far. A third projective test is the Rotter Incomplete Sentence Blank, developed by Julian Rotter in 1950. There are 3 forms of this test for use with different age groups: the school form, the college form, and the adult form. The tests include 40 incomplete sentences that people are asked to complete as quickly as possible. The average time for completing the test is approximately 20 minutes, as responses are only 1 to 2 words in length. This test is similar to a word association test, and like other types of projective tests, it is presumed that responses will reveal desires, fears, and struggles. The RISB is used in screening college students for adjustment problems and in career counseling. And there is the happiest time, my earliest memory of my mother, what annoys me, I want to know, I failed in school, people I hate, men, when I am older, when I was a child, the worst thing a woman can do to a man, a mother, if I were king, when I see men and women together. And those are the sentences that need to be completed. Of course, that's only 16 of them. Robert Williams developed the first culturally specific projective test designed to reflect the everyday life experiences of African Americans. The updated version of the instrument is the Contemporized Themes Concerning Blacks test. The CTCB contains 20 color images that show scenes of African American lifestyles. When the CTCB was compared with the TAT for African Americans, it was found that the use of the CTCB led to increased story length, higher degrees of positive feelings, and stronger identification with the CTCB. Now, this is an interesting picture because this is from his original manuscript or his dissertation, actually. And some of these pictures aren't very good. They're certainly not in color. This guy's shooting marbles. This guy's coming home from work. And this is somebody with an afro. Anyway, it was made in 1972. I learned when it was first put together. The TEMAS Multicultural Thematic Apperception Test is another tool designed to be culturally relevant to minority groups, especially Hispanic youths. TEMAS standing for Tell Me a Story, but also is a play on the Spanish word temas, which means themes, uses images and storytelling cues that relate to minority cultures, and that's according to Constantino in 1982. This is one of the pictures. Anyway, that's it. Okay, we're done. And I need to go outside, so I need to stop this thing right now. I'll see you guys next week.